Okay, we've topped the 250 participant mark, and I know there are more who will be joining us based on registration. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to FairTest Town Hall on suspending high stakes testing in spring 2021 and beyond. I'm Bob Schaefer. I'm the Interim Executive Director at FairTest, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. And we're very pleased that you could join us this late afternoon or early evening. I want to thank our distinguished panelists, all of whom you will meet and hear from quite soon, and the planning committee who worked with FairTest to pull this together, especially our long-term activist friend, Alana Spiegel, a new member of the Colorado State Board of Higher Education, who did the bulk of the organizing, and Kristen Seidel, who's behind the scenes here, handling all of the technical arrangements. Tonight's town hall is part of FairTest's campaign for suspending high stakes federal and state testing mandates, at least for spring 2021. This session is designed to equip you with the information and political knowledge you will need to advocate with policymakers for continuing the testing mandate suspension this spring and hopefully beyond. Here's what you can do on your screen. The links are there and will appear in the chat as well. We'll come back to them at the end. If you have not done so already, please join the 7,000 or so folk, parents, educators, community leaders, and policymakers who've already signed the national call to suspend high stakes testing and sign your organizations on to call or email your US senators and representatives to press the Biden administration Department of Education to approve the test waivers that states are beginning to request. Just this week, New York and Michigan began the process of applying for waivers, and it's going to be necessary for the new Secretary of Education to approve them to waive the federal parts of the requirements. The links are here on your screen. In addition to calling or emailing your federal representatives, do the same for your state test makers. Many states have piled additional testing high stakes on top of the federal requirements, and they need to be suspended too. Misuses of tests for things like graduation, grade promotion, teacher bonuses, et cetera, need to be suspended. And finally, if you can, for free, take advantage of the free resources available at fairtest.org. If you have questions, email us at fairtest.org. And if you can, support our campaign, this campaign's expansion. We're going to end up doing several more of these webinars because of the very high level of interest by donating, by clicking the donate button on anywhere on our website. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to Alana Spiegel. Very pleased to do so. We've worked with Alana for years, as a grassroots advocate in Colorado. And I'm just overwhelmed with pleasure that Alana was elected this year to serve a term on the Colorado State Board of Higher Education. So Alana, it's all yours.
Great, thanks so much, Bob, and welcome everyone. And I have the absolute pleasure of being able to introduce our panelists one by one. And just to let you know, I know Kristen was putting in the chat, so panelists have the ability to mute and unmute themselves, and I'll be introducing them one by one. We will be sharing links in the chat. Attendees, please put your questions in the chat. We'll be able to see them. If we don't answer them with our panelists' responses to the questions, we will be recording those and we'll do our best to get back to you with answers to those questions. We are planning on being joined as soon as he can get on, by Representative Jamal Bowman from New York. He is in between votes, and we are going to just kind of plug him in when I get a message that he's on. So without further ado, though, we're going to go ahead and start with our panelists. And we did ask each of them, who have a tremendous amount to say on this topic, to really, so we could get as many voices as possible, to limit their comments to just a few minutes. Some of them asked to answer one question rather than both of them. And so we'll kind of cycle through them all and get to as much as we can. But the first question we are going to ask our panelists to think about is why we need to suspend tests right now. Why this is so important. And we're going to start with Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig, who is the dean at the University of Kentucky School of Education. So Dr. Heilig.
So you're going to put me on the spot right off the top. Okay. I actually have a question. There might be some folks that want to live tweet. Do we have a hashtag for this event?
I have one to propose.
What do you propose, Doctor?
Suspend testing.
Okay. All right. So
or end testing.
Okay. All right.
Protest the test. There we go.
Okay. Several.
We did want to be very careful, recognizing we are asking people about high stakes student testing and not COVID testing. So that's, that was one of our,
realized that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was one of the ones we were very careful about thinking about,
Okay,
that
great.
information.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I just wanted to get that off the ground. So thank you for coming, all of you. I'll just say a couple of quick things. One of my former students sent me an email this week. She's a testing coordinator in Texas. And she talked about how difficult the logistics are right now for testing. So getting students to school, students not having access to technology to test, the back orders on the testing, the issues with social distancing, even if you were able to get them into the school. So the logistics are very, very difficult. Testing logistics are already challenging in the school setting. And so to actually get all the students tested, very difficult, nearly impossible in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years. That's not even to say the challenges with civil rights related to testing. Now, I know and I'm aware that there are some civil rights organizations out there that are big proponents of testing. But I'm going to tell you, if you go back all the way to the early 1980s, there was a case, Deborah P. Turlington. And that was the case where the NAACP said that testing was unfair for African-American students for a variety of reasons. And if you ask the NAACP now, they are very, very critical of high stakes testing. So the civil rights folks, we understand that there's a split in that community, but the nation's largest and oldest civil rights community has made it very clear. And then finally, we've got to understand the history of testing and what it means for students. And the sorting of society goes all the way back to Greek times. It's called the noble lie, the idea that we must sort society into gold, silver, and bronze. Testing was created for discriminatory and segregatory purposes, and it still operates in that fashion. So in the midst of a pandemic, the twin pandemics, not only a health pandemic, but a social justice and racism pandemic, it is the right thing for us to pause and reassess the regimes of testing that we see nationwide, state to state.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Heilig. And I appreciate your kind of being on the spot and going first there while we were waiting for Representative Bowman to join us. But I was just informed he was just able to get on, and I know he is in between votes and in between meetings. So we're going to go ahead and introduce Representative Jamal Bowman, who, for those of you that don't know, he represents the 16th Congressional District in New York State, which includes the Bronx and parts of Westchester County. And he's a middle school educator and has led community organizing against high stakes testing and the school to prison pipeline. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Representative Bowman for some remarks. Thanks so much.
We have to say the famous thing, which is you're on mute.
Right, on mute and not his camera. So like all of us have yeah, let's have those issues. So it looks like they got some staff issues and they're getting a second to finish out. So while they figure that out on the staff end, we're going to go ahead and keep going. Dr. Lori Shepard here from the University of Colorado, one of our distinguished professors of education. Why don't you go ahead and give your response to that question about why tests need to be suspended now, and we'll get those tech issues worked out with Rep. Bowman.
To capitalize on what Dean Vasquez Heilig already mentioned, the technical issues are enormous. And the people who are advocating for testing are they're just not very forthcoming about these things. So just imagine one example of the schools or districts that sent their computers home with kids. And now, for standardization's sake, have to try to figure out how to bring them back and sanitize them between kids. The detail of the logistics is astronomical and not mentioned. It's also the case that it's not possible to combine in-person testing with remote testing and get accurate information. And also the case that were you to try remote testing, for which there are not good security protocols that don't invade privacy, you end up having the exact same children you're saying you're trying to help, who don't have devices, who don't have internet, and who don't have a quiet place to take the assessments, if you imagine remote testing. So these have long lists of concerns that need to be addressed if you were serious about testing. The reasons not to test are to understand the trauma and disruption of a scale that hasn't been experienced before. And if you care about social emotional development and kids wanting to be excited about learning, you need to think about a way of embracing them and welcoming them back into learning experiences, not have one of the first ways that they return to school be a way to sort them and classify them as good learners or not good learners. Standardized testing takes an enormous amount of instructional time. It's extremely stressful for teachers and disrespectful of what they've been doing all of this time. It's also the case that testing proponents use the word equity, but I have not in any of my conversations been able to press to hear, well, what is it you're going to do with the scores that will be an equitable purpose served? So I imagine, is it to track where the need is greatest? Then I have an alternative. Let's use 2019 school scores. If you have money to invest disproportionately in schools, I can tell you already from 2019 data who needs it most. If it's individual children that need it most, let's count up the kids who actually had no device, who disappeared from schools. If we have money to invest in them, and if you're facing budget cuts instead, then don't tell me about testing, because it's dishonest to say you're going to help with the data. It's also the case that the claim that teachers need these data to plan instruction at the individual student level is not a fair claim either, because the tests that cover a year's worth of instruction tells you way too many things about strengths and weaknesses, maybe. What we need are instructionally grounded assessments that are tied to a unit of instruction so that I can respond after I've assessed, not a laundry list of all the possible things I could instruct if I had a whole year's worth of instruction time to do it. We go on, but it's past my turn.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shepard. Thanks, Lori. And we're gonna go ahead and turn it over next to Dr. Roxana Marashi. And Dr. Marashi, we are so thrilled to have you here. You are kind of a last minute addition, and we could not be more thrilled. And she's the education chair of the California and Hawaii NAACP, and associate professor of education at San Jose State University. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I've learned in doing this work that one of the important things to do is to clarify that the statements I'm going to make are my own and they do not necessarily represent my university or organizations that I'm affiliated with. We have to do that to protect academic freedom. I want to emphasize a number of reasons. I will echo what my colleagues have already said. Several years ago in 2016, the California Alliance of Researchers for Equity in Education had already published a calling for a halt to the use of these tests. The tests have been shown to fail to meet all standards of assessment. They're not valid, they're not reliable, they're not fair, they're not secure, they're not accessible. And so we need to really think carefully about having accountability about accountability. And that's why I'm so glad to be part of this conversation. There's so much to say that it's difficult to summarize. One of the key concerns that I've been following is this transition of the tests to the home environments. If you've been following what's happening in higher education with the online proctoring and the students in higher education that have been calling out these totally predatory, invasive surveillance tactics that are being used by the testing, proctoring testing companies, we are seeing that a similar kind of thing is going to be happening in these tests. I spoke last night with an associate principal of a local high school who is responsible for the administration of the tests, and he shared in detail what is going to be required. Students are going to be required to have their cameras on while they take these tests. Going to be recording them while they take these tests in a pandemic. These tests are being administered to 3rd through 8th graders and 11th graders. Imagine you have an 8-year-old with a camera watching that you're going to be recorded. Everything that you do is going to be recorded. And you better not look down. And it's this hyper surveilling, we're watching you, and it adds to the stress, it adds to the anxiety. This is cruel and unusual practice. This is actually unconscionable. I would consider it to be an abusive practice, for lack of a better word, to require this of students, especially given we're in a pandemic. I've looked at the privacy policies for these tests, which, by the way, cost a lot. I know the 3-year contract for several years ago I saw it was $241 million. Right? That's a lot of money that could be going instead to our schools, to our students, to student supports, and to alternative ways to support them. But what's happening is that the policy, I looked at the privacy policy, it is not protecting student data. And I'm glad that, Julian, you mentioned about the NAACP. One of the recent more resolutions that we just passed at the state and the national level was to protect youth from data exploitation. Right now, I've looked at the companies and the different entities in the consortia that exist where ETS and some of the large testing companies, I should say, are able to share these data with other companies. There's no protection currently for the misuse and abuse of these data in ways that would weaponize our students. Facial recognition is in the news right now. Sentiment analysis. There's no protections right now. And I just got to add one more thing. If you look at the privacy policy, it publicly shows how weak it is. But then there's a part that says biometric identifier privacy policy. That's not public on the site. You have to email separately in order to get that. And so there are many, many issues, layers of issues. I'll just again highlight the California Alliance of Researchers for Equity in Education have already opposed this test, and that there are very serious state issues. I know that we're short on time, so I'll leave it here. I'm going to leave some links in the chat for folks if you wanted to learn more about some of the concerns. Thank you.
Dr. Marchi, thank you so much. I know, so much great information to share about all the different aspects about this. It looks like we do have Representative Bowman on the line now. It looks like we got him in on the go there. And without further ado, I already gave your introduction before. We're going to turn it over to the amazing Representative Jamal Bowman from New York.
Hey everyone, sorry I'm late to the call, was running around dealing with some family stuff. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for doing this. As many of you know, this testing fight is a fight we've all been a part of for a very long time. The reason why we're a part of this fight, because we know that the current system that is in place is much more harmful than it is beneficial. It does a lot more harm than good. And that's because of a couple of reasons. Number one, we have to question the validity and reliability of the tests that are being administered on an annual basis. There's research that's been done on these tests over the years, and it has been found that the tests are both unreliable and not valid in measuring what they claim to measure. Number two, these tests in New York State and many places across the country are often created by third-party for-profit vendors. They are not created by teachers, not created by educators, and as a result, they are part of a for-profit mechanism that continues to try to infiltrate public education and disrupt schools and disrupt the teaching and learning process. Number three, they've been a part of the No Child Left Behind policy, as you all know, and that came into place in 2001, so we're 20 years in. The goal was to close the achievement gap, and the goal was to get us to 100% literacy in 15 years, I believe, and we have failed in both of those goals, as you all know. Number four, the tests have been used as a weapon to quote unquote hold teachers accountable. And if teachers do not show certain scores on these particular tests, the teacher is rated ineffective, public schools are rated ineffective, and then they are closed in favor of the charter school lobby, which is also a market-based for-profit lobby, as you all know. And number five, the tests do not align with the needs of a 21st century economy. They're overused and misused. There's no need for them to be given every year. There's no need for kids who are 8 years old to be sitting for more testing time than someone who's studying for the LSAT or taking the law school exam, the bar exam. So that makes them unacceptable as well. And then lastly, I'll reiterate what I said about the annual testing in grades 3 through 8 as part of No Child Left Behind. No research that shows it's effective for our kids. So I support, as you all know, canceling the tests, not just this year, but we need to cancel the annual testing system that's in place going forward and bring in something that's more progressive, that taps into the creativity of our children and focuses on educating the whole child. For me, that's music, that's the arts, that's recess, that's play, that's physical education, that's technology, that's Montessori, that's Reggio Emilia, that's all of the things, all of the progressive policies that are implemented in the top private schools that do not test, that should be implemented in public schools. But more importantly, they align to human development. We need a curriculum and instructional program that aligns to human development and that are developmentally appropriate. And then lastly, in terms of what our public schools needs, let's focus much more on early childhood education, making sure our children from birth to age 4 are nurtured in quality community and home environments so that when they enter kindergarten, they are ready to thrive. Our children have unlimited potential, and our schools and our government hasn't done enough to unlock that potential. So I'm so happy that you are all continuing to fight. Please continue to fight on a national level and get in touch with my colleagues in Congress so that they understand what needs to happen in our schools based on research. Too many in Congress do not follow the science, not only when it comes to climate change, but when it comes to education. The research has been done on what we need to do for our kids. We just haven't invested in our children, particularly our poor Black and brown children. So I'm excited to be in the fight with you all. Thank you all for having me. And listen, we are winning and we are going to win. I was a major part of the opt-out movement. Shout out to New York City opt-out, shout out to AQE, shout out to Class Size Matters, shout out to NICEAPE, shout out to every group in New York State, United Opt-out across the country, shout out to We Choose Jitu Brown, Zakia Ansari, Lainey Hameson, Janine Sopp, Jeanette Duderman, Lisa Rully, the whole crew. Shout out to the whole crew. We did it in New York, and it's because we did it in New York that I got my butt into Congress, and now I'm going to be fighting in Congress with and for all of you on the Education and Labor Committee. Let's do it. Let's go.
Rep Bowman, you know, everyone, I know everyone knows where their reaction things are. I've been doing this long enough, but you know, jazz hands, applause. What an amazing advocate for us to have in Congress representing our friends and neighbors over there in New York. But you heard what Rep Bowman said, and you know, Bob said at the top of the presentation, and we'll continue to put that in the chat, kind of that petition, really to say we need to do this now. We need to suspend these tests now. Contact information for other elected officials in DC. You know, we're hearing from all of these people, all these different examples of why this has to happen now. And we're going to continue a little bit more about why we need to do this now. And then we're also going to get into, but what else are we going to do? So Rep Bowman, thank you so much for representing New York, for taking the time to be here. And I'm gonna turn it back over to our panel. We'll share with you a lot of the questions we get, especially the ones directed to you, Rep Bowman, with your office. But the next person on our panel is one of my colleagues here in Colorado on the K-12 State Board of Education, and that's Dr. Lisa Escarcica. So Lisa, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Representative Bowman. I've been never again am I going. But hey, you got me so jazzed. So I am on the State Board of Education, and much like one of my other colleagues here, I have to say I am not here representing the board's views. What you hear are my own, which is after almost 40 years of experience K-12, particularly in an assessment. It's that experience I'm going to talk to. I think I want to bring back and talk a little bit about the social justice piece, and kind of tying in with what Dr. Shepard said around the logistics and this idea of when you're thinking of policies, especially testing. So who is it going to benefit and who is it going to harm? So I've talked with several of the technology directors across the state, was on the phone with one for a long time yesterday. We have deployed tens of thousands of devices out to our students. And those students, of course, were the students who didn't have them. They still are trying to get them in everybody's hands. So who are they? There are BIPOC students. There are Black, Indigenous, students of color, our low-income students. They got them over the spring. They got them in the summer. They're getting them in the fall. Those, many of them were collected out directly out of schools, right? You know, you have the little carts in which you mobilize and you use for testing. Those don't exist anymore. They're out in the field. So this director is talking to me about how he's making the decision right now within the next 2 weeks of which of those devices he's going to recall. He has to recall a significant number of them and bring them in. He's going to have to clean them, of course, outside and in. He's got to put the security on them. They have to stay there. Now in his head, he's thinking, I'm going to try to avoid my free reduced lunch kits. Now this is a district with 10%. In Denver, close to 70% of the students are on free reduced lunch. 75% of the district are students of color. Fully 40% of the district is on not in person. They are fully remote and are going to be for the rest of the year. Whose devices are you going to get? How are you going to get the students in? That was the other question. We no longer offer transportation to middle and high school. We had to use it all for elementary. Who's going to get harmed? And he said, Lisa, it's draconian. In 2 weeks, I have to start this unless you all get me a message that I don't have to do this. It has to happen now. And so I think just bringing that back, people are not asking the right questions. They're asking questions like Dr. Shepard said, what will we use? And we're going to answer that in a moment. They're not asking the really important questions. What is the true benefit and who is going to benefit most and who is going to be harmed? So thank you.
Great, thanks, Dr. Escarcica. Really appreciate your perspective. And we're gonna bump it next to Roberto Jimenez, who is a Chelsea, Massachusetts School Committee member. So Roberto, you wanna give your thoughts on why we need to do this now?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. So this is really, so just for context, Chelsea is was kind of the first epicenter of the pandemic here in Massachusetts. You know, our rates in the kind of when the first big surge hit us were kind of parallel with some of the hardest hit parts of New York City, right? So it was a really, it really hit us hard, and it continues to hit to affect our community, right? It's mostly an immigrant community. About 90% of our students in our community and in our schools are Latinx. Many of them immigrants, right? And so whenever people ask me about these tests, there's kind of three things that I tell them are the reasons why I think we should cancel this test, right? There's logistics, there's the validity of this test this year, right? Even if you believe in testing, right? The validity this year alone is even more, questionable than usual. And then the third thing is maximizing our learning time, right? So when it comes to the logistics, right? Bringing back students into our buildings just for taking this test, right? It's putting kids at risk when we've been working so hard throughout the whole year to prevent this risk from happening, right? So we're fully remote, have been all year, right? And I, as the person who would ultimately be making the decision to bring people back, don't feel comfortable with bringing students back to give them a test that we know is flawed in so many ways, even before this pandemic, right? And now with this pandemic, it's even more flawed, right? And then speaking to the validity, right? There's really no good way of controlling for a once in a lifetime pandemic, right? So how are we, and this is probably something that the researchers in the panel can address better than I can, right? But I can guarantee you that if I give you a standardized test on the day that your grandmother passed away, you're not going to do well. And that's what these kids have been living through for the last 9 months, right? It's a constant toxic stress on their lives and the lives of, the adults in their family as well, which then impacts those kids as well. So it's really, just giving them this test it's not going to get us the data that we want, right? Even if we're doing it for the best of reasons, we're not going to get the data that we want. And then the last piece is about maximizing the learning time, right? Testing is a measure that we misuse pretty much all the time. It's not a learning tool, right? So if we only have so many hours in a day and so many days in a school year, we should be spending that time educating our students instead of teaching them how to take a test that's going to tell us roughly the same as looking at their parents' income and their parents' educational level. These tests are not reflective of how we evaluate people in the real world. So I think that learning test taking skills should be at the bottom of our priority list, and frankly, not even on that list. And so that's I think we need to make sure that we're educating our students on what we actually want them to have, what skills we want them to have after they leave our schools, after they graduate from college or any type of higher education and move into their career. And I don't know about you, but I have not been evaluated on any kind of standardized test since I left school, and I think we should do the same for our kids.
Great, thank you so much, Roberto. And going to turn it over for our last panelist to kind of talk about this question about why we need to do this now. And that's Dr. Jack Schneider, an assistant professor of leadership and education at UMass, author, historian. So Dr. Schneider, go ahead.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on a panel with so many smart people. And I think we've covered the issue from a lot of different angles here. I think the thing that I tend to talk about is the fact that our national obsession with standardized testing distorts the process of education. That's because of how narrowly we measure. And it's also because of the high stakes that we attach to those measurements. So, I like to think about these basic questions that we seem to have skipped in terms of launching into this 20-year project in testing kids and holding schools to those test scores. So what do we value, right? What do we want for young people in our communities? And I get that the answer probably differs from person to person and place to place, but I guarantee you the answer is never simply basic academic competencies in 2 subject areas, right? That is not people's answer. And failing to measure everything that matters, we allow important outcomes and processes to be displaced. Because the things we do measure tend to correlate strongly with demographic variables, as Roberto just noted, like family income, race, parental educational attainment. The consequences of this measurement regime tend to land really inequitably across our communities. Where do schools get shut down? It's in Black and brown communities. It's in poor communities. And that's in ordinary times, right? And these are not ordinary times. So your question is, why tests need to be suspended now? And I think that's the ordinary answer. And it's a pretty good answer, I think. But in this crisis, it's more obvious than ever that schools don't simply exist to raise scores in math and reading, right? They're essential lifelines. They provide food and psychological care. They provide social connection. They give structure to the day. I mean, at their best, schools motivate and engage kids, right? That's not math and reading scores as measured by a machine. And along with promoting deep learning, our schools tend to bring a little happiness and laughter into the world. Again, right? Something that we need now more than ever. So now, more clearly than ever, we ought to see how foolish it is to reduce the scope of what we mean by education, and particularly if it has disproportional effects on the least advantaged. So I think now, right, this is something we should be doing always, but now more than ever, we should resist attaching high stakes to these narrow measures because we know it undermines the full mission of public education, which we need now more than ever.
Well, thank you so much, Jack, for closing out that part of our panel about now, why these things have been, if they've been important for a while under ordinary times, why it's even more important under extraordinary times, which is what we're in right now. And I think one of the other things we asked the panel really to think about, though, is, you know, if not now, then what? Not when, right? But you know, what else can we be doing? What can we be doing better? We have an incredible opportunity right now to really think about alternatives that are meaningful and relevant. So I'm going to ask you each to keep it kind of brief. Some of you had said you had wanted to, you know, use more of your time in the beginning, so we might not get to everyone in this next part. But am gonna start back with, you know, Dr. Heilig, what about you? What can we do going forward? What can we be doing better?
So first, I want to give a shout out to Jack because he and I went back and forth on this topic in Ed Week in 2014. So we talked about what we should be doing instead. The title of the blog was, "Why are we using standardized tests?" So just Google Jack and myself. And in there, we talk about formative and summative assessments, portfolios, performance assessments. There are a lot of alternatives. I even sat down with my buddy, who one of my best friends. He's an educator in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he in their school, and of course he's in a school that serves predominantly wealthy students on the peninsula. And they do these portfolio assessments for graduation, where students come together and they demonstrate what they've learned for a group of teachers. So there's a lot of ways that we can do this at the local level, using the expertise of the educators who are actually closer to the work that students are doing. And I know FairTest has done a lot of work on this over the years. I also want to point you to my blog, Cloaking Inequity. I have a whole section on high stakes testing that I've been writing over the years. I know we have limited time. I've just given you plenty of homework. So check out the Ed Week, check out the blog, Cloaking Inequity. And then I just wanted to dovetail with something that Roberto said. I've also done work on English learners and high stakes tests, and how these tests take advantage of the trust that immigrant students and their families have in schools for their success. So also check out that piece in Teachers College Record if you want to take a look at the interactions and the relationship between English learners and these testing regimes.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Heilig. And yeah, Dr. Heilig is giving everyone homework, and I think each of our panelists can and are in the chat, and we're going to give them homework too, to questions that we don't get answered, and so we can really continue the conversation. Just so people know, we're so thrilled with the participation here. Gonna move next to Dr. Shepard. Lori, what about you? What else do you think we can be doing? What comes next?
Well, obviously what we'd like to focus on are deep learning experiences for our students that have the array of values that have already been mentioned by my colleagues here. And I want to shout out to Principal Jeff Palladino from Fannie Lou Hamer High School in the Bronx. I'm sorry, Representative Bowman had to go because I've been for portfolios and project-based learning for a long time, but at that high school, working and learning about the depth of accomplishment when young people focused on habits of mind, spend time on project work in a school that's part of the consortium, the New York Performance Standards Consortia, that is exempt from the Regents exams, and therefore allows teachers to focus deeply on students doing project work that's meaningful to them, that's about the community, what's happening in the Bronx, what racial justice summer issues mean for them now. Those are the things that they can write about and that they can be held to account by, as was mentioned in the previous example, by a panel of teachers interviewing them when it's time for graduation, so that they can demonstrate the competencies that have been developed. And that is separate from what does the state need to know, which I think is a very different data collection that's much more like the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's low stakes, it's less frequent, as Jack also mentioned. We don't need to do this over and over and over again. We need to have what students do in interaction with their teachers to assess and support their learning be something different from data collection. And we need to re-examine what we mean by accountability. We do not need comparability and standardization and exactly the same evidence from every school. As soon as you say you have to have that for accountability, you create the narrowness that everyone is so aware is harmful, but they don't know how to get out of that box. And so I'm for not comparability. I'm for equivalent rigor and audits or check-ins that find schools that aren't holding kids to account. But I don't need a uniform measure as my way of making sure that that there's quality educating going on in all of our schools.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Shepherd. And what about you, Dr. Marshy? What do you think about this question of what next? What else can we be doing? What can we do that's even better?
Thank you. So I will echo some of what Dr. Shepherd had also mentioned about the New York State Performance Standards Consortium. They've done excellent work. And I think the real, big picture is that we need to keep assessment local. It needs to be local. It needs to be done by teachers. It needs to be done in an authentic, organic ways. And it needs to be motivating for the youth. It has to be an experience that they enjoy and that they learn from, and that contributes to the learning. And again, moving away from this comparative national, which state is better than the rest, that's just Hunger Games, if you really want to look at what's happening in big picture. I want to address another issue that was brought up about the marketing around these tests, the notions where they're saying this is going to improve equity. There's a lot of doublespeak going on with the marketing. And in the same way that the big oil companies do greenwashing, we have to really pay attention to the equity washing and the language that you see where they've got beautiful websites and saying that, oh, this was developed by teachers and this, no. You have to peel back, look at the contracts, look at who it was really developed by. And it's organizations, corporations with a ton of power, and far more say in what is going on. We have to have the public be part of the conversations around the assessment. And then the last thing I wanted to add is this. We have to talk about this pressure that administrators are under constantly to have to push their students and families to take these tests. There is a twisting of that 95% mandate. And I want to talk about that. It's really, really important, because long ago, and I don't know the timeline of this, it used to be that some of the schools, from what my understanding was, that they would test the students in the fall, and then in the spring, they would send a subset of the students, the lowest performing 30% or so, you're gonna go on a field trip, and then they test the rest, and then all of a sudden, magically, you have these high test scores, right? And so in order to prevent that, they said, we need to offer the test for at least 95% of all the students. It has to be offered to 95% of the students. This got twisted, and I believe it was about 5 years ago. It was when I really started to pay attention to the mandates. And now principals and administrators, teachers are getting the message that we have to test 95% or else somehow we don't get funding. That's a lie. It's not. They need to offer it to 95%. And that's a very important difference. And we need to encourage also be aligned with the requirements to inform parents of the right to opt out. These are optional tests. They have to be able to opt out. The school districts that have had very high opt-out rates have not lost their funding. So I just wanted to clarify some of those misunderstandings, and the administrator that I talked with was under a lot of pressure. And I know that this is getting off of the question of like, what should we do instead? I think what we should do instead is have these conversations about that 95% number, and to continue these conversations about these issues. And thank you to all the panelists. I echo all of what you're saying too, so thank you.
Well, I totally second that. About, I think if we're learning one thing tonight, it's that we need to be having more of these conversations and opportunities to talk about what else. And I'm fortunate I've had the opportunity to have that conversation for many years now with Lisa Escarsica, and talking about what else can we be doing. I mean, Lisa, you go for it. What do you think?
Well, I am, looking at this question, I think I was looking at it more from the sense of people saying, well, we won't have this data. How will we know where our students are? How will we know the impact of the pandemic? And what else can we use? And so looking at it from that kind of framework, my kind of lines are, and Dr. Shepherd's gonna love this, we have decades of NAEP data that tell you where our students are. And I have decades of state assessment that tell you where our students are. We have interim assessments right now. You're hearing about them, NWEA. We have a sense, reading, we're not far as behind in math, it might be a few months. You have quite a bit of information. And as a program evaluator and somebody who used to do this, right, go into the schools and look at them, you can use that data for an overall sense, but it's not helping with improvement. It's not helping with instruction. So what do, I kind of throw this out there. If you want to know really what the impact is without doing more testing, take a look at other indicators like how students have done and how different populations have done in healthcare, how they're doing in the workforce, how they're doing in housing. 70% of the variance in our student achievement scores actually are a result of those factors. So we know what the pandemic has done there, right? We're seeing those outcomes. I can give you a real good guess of what it's done to our kids in schools. So it's just a moot question. We can't do anything with resources if we don't have this data. And the other thing I kind of pull up, and it's like, well, I see that Hickenlooper, one of our governors, he says, yep, we're going to make sure money is aimed at providing mental health supports, protective, PPE, testing and vaccines to students. The governor just gave out $27 million, support career training, literacy programs, indigenous curriculum, all good things, didn't need testing. We can do this all without this information. So, and what Ilana and I had done, we developed kind of along the lines of doing, sampling. There are things like that people just don't want to talk about. They don't want to listen to the science. They don't want to listen to the research. You can test 1/10 of the students that we do right now and get all the information you need, but it's not the right information to improve schools, and it's not the right information to improve outcome for kids. So, and Dr. Snyder is going to get into that, I'm sure, a little bit. By the way, one of my favorites. I'm a big fan of the blog and have the book. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And we'll probably close it out with Dr. Snyder because he's written a whole book about what else we can do. But Roberto, what about you as a school committee member there in Chelsea? What else can we be doing right now? What can we be doing better?
Yeah, so I think the main problem that I have with the concept of standardized testing is in the term itself, right? Standardized. We're trying to put districts and students on a bell curve by giving the test, and we could do it with students' parental income and education levels, like I said before, and we get roughly the same, same results at a lower cost. But I think we need to think about this not as a competition, right? It has to be a collaboration to get as many people as possible prepared, and it's not just about like just who's going to do better, right? Who's going to get into Harvard? Who's going to get into Yale, right? Which I feel like it often ends up being, all about that, especially, my former career as an admissions officer, thinking about the SAT and the ACT. But if we continue to focus on a bell curve, pitting schools and students against each other to be the best, using these assessments that we know are broken, supporting systems that consistently place students of colors and their schools at the bottom, right? Students of color are always going to be at the bottom because they're at a resource disadvantage. So when I think about what we can do instead of testing, I think that we just need to invest in our schools to ensure that our poor communities have access to the resources of wealthy communities, right? My students in Chelsea, they need more space in school. They need more mental health counseling, more college counseling. They need access to broader curriculum and smaller class sizes, right? Otherwise, it doesn't matter what the assessment is, right? But it's going to give us the same results. It's going to lead to more communities of color being silenced when the state takes them over, right? And we know that these takeovers are happening almost exclusively in Black and Latinx schools and districts, right? And that's the ultimate, that is the ultimate impact of these tests, right? It's silencing those communities and telling the students of color that they're below average and that their schools are failing, right? And like, yes, we should expand performance-based assessments that focus on how students actually learn, right? You get feedback, you build on your learning, you make mistakes and you grow, right? That's what school should be about. It should be a safe space to learn how to be an effective human being after you become an adult, right? And I know that, I know that the focus of this panel isn't on college admissions, but I just want to highlight the doubly harmful effect of the SAT and the ACT on our students, since more and more states are actually using them for high school for the testing requirement. So it's on top of on how damaging they are for students in the college admissions process. Now they're even further narrowing the curriculum because it really only tests a small subset of math and kind of a whitewash version of English and language arts. So it's really just on so many levels, right? We're really just harming communities of color and then harming students, all of them, right? Both students of color and white students, by narrowing down the curriculum and really making school about this is the term that Jack always uses, right? It's a positional good, right? And it really shouldn't be. It should be about making sure that all students can be successful and can have a successful life after school.
So Roberto, did I hear somewhere in there a challenge for a follow-up panel on the ACT and SAT and test optional admissions? I think I may have heard that as a follow-up to suspending testing. Now that somebody who spends a lot of time in higher ed, I'm gonna hold you to that one.
Absolutely, I left that world not that long ago, and I still appreciate talking about it. So happy to do so.
Great. Well, putting that in my notes. Well, with that though, let's turn it over to Jack, who has written extensively about this, talks extensively, really, because that's the question. If not these tests, then what? And that's often a question a lot of people get. So go for it, Dr. Snyder. Close us out with that.
Right. Well, so one thing that is really important to think about here is something that was in the original question, the way it was asked, which is what can be done instead of high stakes standardized testing now going forward? And I think that's really important because one answer to that question is simple, right? And it's very actionable. Instead of high stakes testing, just have testing. Right? If you de-weaponize the tests, and I know this is often not a popular position because the tests suck, right? Like I've got a 10-year-old. I've watched the impact of the tests on her motivation, right? On what she thinks school is about. But if you de-weaponize the tests, most of the negative consequences fall away, right? And the stakes of the test, and this needs to be made really clear by us as activists, to people who have the power to make these changes. The stakes don't motivate educators or spur improvement. They incentivize gaming and disempower communities. So there's a second answer, right? So that's the, if we include the high stakes piece, because all we need to do is remove the stakes there. Right? Second answer is a little more complicated, because even if we eliminate formal state sanctions, we get rid of the stakes, we know that testing data is still incorporated into third-party ratings like those created by greatschools.org. And those great school ratings, of course, are baked into real estate websites like Zillow and Truly. You want to talk about racism in action, right? So people are making decisions in the real world based on these ratings. There's going to be pressure on schools in response to that, even if the state drops sanctions. So in addition to de-weaponizing these state accountability systems, it's also important to measure more broadly, right? Working to capture all that we value and not just test scores. And it's really important to do so in a way that does not simply offer demographic data in disguise, right? Because so many of these data points, attendance, which is in many of the ESSA plans, raw standardized test scores in math, raw standardized test scores in English language arts, that graduation rates for high schools, right, correlate strongly with demographic variables. And so when all you do is you put those into an algorithm and you come out with a rating, of course, schools serving low-income kids, BIPOC kids, kids with special education needs, of course they look worse, right? And what that leads to is segregation. Even if we got rid of the school closures piece, which is racist and classist and unjust, we would still have this problem of exacerbating neighborhood segregation. I'm going to wind it up because I see we've only got 2 minutes left, and just say a group that I co-founded, the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment, is working to do that, measure more broadly and more fairly. And I'll spare you the details. You can get those on our website, and I'm putting that in the chat here. And I also wrote a whole book about it, so you can go get endless detail there. The point is, it's possible. Right? We can build a better system for measuring student learning and school quality. The choice isn't between bad data and no data. That's a lie we've heard for too long, right? We can't just throw away our test scores because then we'll have nothing. That's not true. The choice is between doing this wrong, as we currently do, and working to make it right, right? If we have the political will, right, we can find a way to do this better in a way that is more responsible.
Great. Wow, Jack, thank you. Thank you so much for those amazing words to kind of close us out about, the choice, the choices we have, and how, sometimes it's, a false dichotomy that we're being asked to choose between. And the question is, do we have the will? And with that, we got about a minute left. I'm going to turn it back over to Bob to remind people of what they can do. We heard Rep Bowman talk about that, and Bob's going to talk about that some more. And it sounds like we'll probably have some follow-up conversations with some of the panelists as well. So look for those. So Bob, why don't you close us out here?
Well, thank you very much, Alana, and what a wonderful set of panels. I was watching the chat and responding to it as I could. If you've read everything that was going on and go back and listen to this, you'll get a PhD in assessment reform. But as Jack said right at the end, right now we need to understand that testing policy is driven as much or more by politics than by education. And that the only way we're going to win what's necessary, suspending tests this year and overhauling them for the future, is through political power. And doing that is going to take people, everyone on this call, and there were more than 360 of you at one time, to take action now. Sign the petition, call or email your members of Congress, the same for your state legislators, and support this national campaign. We've posted lots of links in the chat. We'll make that available to you afterward, and use those as tools, not just to educate yourselves, but to press policymakers to make the changes that all of us know are necessary. Thanks again to all of you, especially our panelists and moderators and technical support. We'll be back soon with another session. This was a great opportunity to move us all forward. Thank you and good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
You appreciate it.
Bye-bye, take care.
Thank you. That was great. Better.
This happens a lot in a lot of meetings that I'm on where it keeps recording. So you might want to.
Yeah, I think it is
That's all I'm
still,
gonna